It's nice to be back here in Poland and in Warsaw and with my friends at Ordo Iuris. I want to talk about the family policy in the broadest sense. I'm not a lawyer myself or a practitioner in the field of family policy. My field is politics, so I want to talk about the role of the relation between the family and the state. And I want to do three things. First, I want to start by talking briefly about a historical perspective on where this has come from and where it may be going. From there, I want to describe some of the current trends that are going on in family policy in the Western world. And having set that context, I would then like to speak a little bit, a few comments about the recent family policy here in Poland. History, in some ways, does not appear to be on the side of the family. It seems to be on the side of the state. I want to start by quoting a couple of historians, historical sociologists really, who argue that there is in effect a kind of inverse relationship between the family and the state. As the state becomes more powerful in the course of modern history, the family becomes weaker. And this has been the trend since the Renaissance, really. In many ways, as early as 1933, Christopher Dawson was drawing parallels with Greece and Rome and the decline of the family in those civilizations. Later in 1947, Carl Zimmerman in Family and Civilization, despite the baby boom, so-called, he argued that the family had been declining since the Renaissance and was passing the point of no return. These writers make very powerful reading today. Of course, they were writing before the radicalism of the 1960s, put the family on the political agenda and made it a subject of political contention. Without dwelling or neglecting family factors, Dawson and Zimmerman also had a very keen understanding of the role of the state and the power wielded by government in the family decline, much more so, I think, than some advocates today. As Dawson said, as the decline in the ancient world, the family is steadily losing its form and social significance, and the state absorbs more and more of the life of its members. Functions which were formerly filled by the head of the family are now being taken over by the state, which educates the children and takes responsibility for their maintenance. Again, this is 1933. And this is quite a startling observation he makes. He says that the father no longer holds a vital position in the family. He is often a comparative stranger to his children who know him only as that man who comes for weekends. Zimmerman also pointed out that the state had a vital role, a central role in the destruction of the family. He said whenever the family shows signs of dysfunction, quote, the state helps to break it up. The state wishes to have only enough family power left as needed to achieve its functions. He argued that in the 19th century, law, quote, law piled on law and government agency on government agency until by 1900, the state had become the master of the family. Okay, again, in 1947, Zimmerman wrote, the family is now truly the agent, the slave, and the handmaiden of the state. From today's perspective, 1947 might seem like a kind of golden age of the family. But as Zimmerman observed, these changes came about slowly over centuries, almost imperceptibly. So each generation becomes acculturated to these changes and passes them on to the next generation, which adds more changes of its own. So it's quite striking. We don't notice. It would have been shocking to our grandparents if this had happened all at once, but over the course of time, this happens in ways that we don't even notice. Premarital sex, explicit dress, cohabitation, illegitimacy, divorce, daycare, convenience food, same-sex marriage, transgenderism. These things happen gradually, and we become acculturated to them. But there's more than just the deterioration of the family at work here. The filial rebellion, which I argue is behind much of the family deterioration, is also closely connected with political rebellion. And Zimmerman describes the family policies enacted not only during the Russian and French revolutions, but even following the American Revolution. And all of this amounts to gradual erosions of constitutional protections of individual rights for freedom and family privacy by the ever-expanding government machinery. G.K. Chesterton once warned that the family is the most important check on the power of the state. And it's hardly surprising that the state, in many ways, is kind of fighting back now, and that we see the growth of the social work and psychotherapeutic industries, organized feminism, a heavily politicized judiciary, have combined to wage a kind of bureaucratic war on the family. So today we are seeing really the continuation of these trends that Zimmerman and Dawson pointed out decades ago, much more extreme now. From governments and from transnational institutions like the European Union and the United Nations. What's invariably described as assistance to the family, families which may not necessarily have requested it. So we need to exercise some scrutiny and skepticism toward these programs. Consistent with what we've seen in history, what is invariably described as helping the family often includes government power to increase government control over what had previously been considered private family life. In many cases, in extreme cases, what we even see in family policy is a process of government actually creating problems for itself to solve, which create, of course, new policies, new spending, and additional bureaucracies. Many of these, this growth of government power over the family is initiated with claims of parental insufficiency, which allows the state a wedge, an entree into the family to assume parental functions. Claims of parental deficiency often become allegations of even parental criminality, to rationalize increasing government power. Claims of child abuse, educational neglect, domestic violence, demands for allegedly unpaid child support. None of these matters are actually adjudicated as crimes in most countries, but they are all used to rationalize inserting the state as a barrier between parents and their children. Proof is seldom required, and due process of law is seldom involved. In fact, in some cases, for most divorce cases, parents can lose their children without even an allegation of any legal wrongdoing whatsoever. Legally unimpeachable parents can lose their children. This system, this regime of the state government, the state family machinery, is also often backed up by a system of what amounts to bureaucratic police. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the now famous Badnariu case involving the Romanian family in Norway, which I'm told Ordo Iuris has been involved in to some extent. But there are many more examples that could be quoted, of similar examples. The government appropriation of children is now a very serious trend in the Western democracies, and it's also a threat to the privacy and civil liberties and constitutional government of all citizens. And this is why the recent Polish government's attention to parental rights is so very, very important. Most of these abuses these trends originate in the system in the welfare system. It's not called the welfare state for nothing. In the Western world, much of what we call the welfare state has become really a kind of miniature penal apparatus with its own tribunals, prosecutors, police, jails, juvenile and family courts, domestic violence courts, matrimonial lawyers, child protective services, domestic violence officers, anti-bullying officers, child support enforcement agents, and more. Much of this was created to address the problems endemic to low-income families, single-parent homes on public assistance. Increasingly, these things are spreading to include middle-class families, even intact families as well. The cutting edge of this trend is taking place, I think, in the Anglophone countries. I would cite primarily Canada and the United States, with Britain not far behind. Just again, to look at the history again, Alexis de Tocqueville at the inception of American democracy in the 1830s warned about what he said. He warned about this very thing. He said, "There is no country in Europe where public administration has become not only more centralized, but more inquisitive and detailed than in the United States," he says. Everywhere, and this could be written with family policy in mind. It's amazing, these words he chooses. Everywhere it penetrates further into private affairs. In its manner, it regulates more actions and establishes itself more every day beside, around and above each individual to assist him, counsel him, and constrain him. More recently, here in communist Europe, many dissidents made it a theme of how the communist system was a warning to the Western world. Havel, Solzhenitsyn, and others warned that the communist system was a warning to the West that what was happening was coming here. And I could show you instances in many kinds during the communist system how children were used as leverage to control their parents by the secret police throughout the East Central Europe as ways of leverage to control the citizens. So it's no accident that many of these policies were enacted, again, during the radical regimes of the Jacobin and Bolshevik governments, and even actually following the American Revolution. Much of this trend increased dramatically during the 1990s. In the United States, especially under the aphorism, the maxim of Hillary Clinton, who said, "There is no such thing as other people's children." And I could explain to you, if you like, some of the policies that were put in place during the 1990s. If I had to give you one particular policy change that had a dramatic effect more than any other, I think the font from which much of this emerges, it was the legislation of no-fault divorce laws in the 1970s, which created the regime, or greatly stimulated the process of single-parent homes, and therefore of the entree of government machinery into the private household. And the creation of neighborhoods of crime, substance abuse, and more recently, I think of terrorism, single-parent homes, not just of individual homes, but of entire communities like this. So that's very brief, but I measured against this, I think the current Polish family policy, and this is my knowledge of this comes entirely from last year's Ordo Iuris report, so you have to forgive me if I'm not, if I make factual mistakes, but this is where I'm basing my analysis. But I think in many ways the current policies of the Polish government over the last 2 years are ambiguous. On the one hand, Poland is a self-identified Christian country, and clearly these policies are intended to strengthen and reinforce the family. It's also true, however, that family policy often has unintended consequences, and that certain measures can be reinterpreted and channeled in ways that are not necessarily intended. Measures devoted specifically to strengthening motherhood, for example, seem unexceptionable, and they're very good. On the other hand, the trend towards single motherhood is something that does not need to be encouraged. If anything, Western societies are increasingly recognizing the importance of fatherhood, and certainly the two-parent family together, and perhaps especially the fatherhood. It is fatherlessness that accounts more than anything for the social pathologies that we see in the Western world, especially, that I just outlined. Likewise, the Polish government's aim to increase the fertility rate is likewise laudable. But again, it's only a small part of a much larger problem that I think needs to be attacked at its entirety, rather than simply providing financial incentives for more children. Again, we don't need financial incentives for more single parents. We have many financial incentives for that already. We need incentives for married parenthood. And that's going to be a little more challenged than just providing financial incentives, I think. Likewise, I think that, again, the Polish government's emphasis on parental rights is striking and very inspiring. And I hope other governments will follow this. But I think it's very limited as it is now. It's mostly aimed at, seems to be to me, aimed at preventing children from being removed from their families because of reasons of poverty. But poverty is only one reason the children are unjustly removed from their homes and their parents. Much more frequent reasons are unjust accusations of child abuse, unjust homeschooling, unjust divorce procedures, all of which, by the way, may be undergirded or reinforced by violations of religious freedom and religious discrimination. The Benariu case is, again, a good example of all of that. So poverty is important, but when you have two-parent families together anyway, generally the problem of poverty doesn't exist. It goes away, which of course is desirable for its own sake. So the poverty issue is important, but the two-parent family is the best solution for that. I could also comment to you about childcare and some others, which again can have good consequences and perhaps sometimes not so good consequences. But I want to make 2 points to leave you with just generally, and maybe we could discuss some more. And that is, this problem is very closely related to two larger crises in the Western world that we need to confront. All of this, much of this originates in the welfare state. And the Western world needs to have a dialogue about the welfare state. We must grasp this nettle. It's the cause of the financial crisis of 2008. We cannot continue open-ended government spending on domestic problems. Most of these problems I've outlined, education, healthcare, law enforcement, all come from the family crisis and, of course, welfare spending itself. The second crisis that needs to be addressed is, as Professor Stemkowski indicated, and one which the Polish government has done a very impressive job of exercising leadership recently, and that is the political power of the judiciary. The world, and this is a worldwide phenomenon, all over the world, the judiciary is acquiring political power. How do you control that without stepping on the principle of independent judiciary? We all believe in the independent judiciary. We don't all believe that the judiciary should have political power. How do you control that? How do you strike that balance? There's no good dialogue on that. Poland has started that dialogue. I hope you will continue it. These are just some thoughts. I hope that we can discuss. Oh, and the point too is that our experience in the United States, Canada, and Britain is nowhere is judicial power greater. Nowhere is judicial power more out of control than in the family courts and the courts that deal with families and domestic relations. So please think about that. Thank you for your time, and God bless.